All right, let's do this thing. We're 1874, folks. It's crazy how fast these speedruns end up going. But I think this is the most interesting part of the speedrun for a lot of people because almost all of the games are now very competitive. We're still winning a couple quickly, but most of the games, including the last one, if you want to watch a really good speedrun game, I published the VOD on yesterday's stream, and it was, or streamed day before yesterday. I didn't stream yesterday. And it was super interesting. Like, it was a game full of tactical details and all sorts of cool stuff. All right, but for now, let's continue. We'll probably get black, and we will 1988. Okay, good year. And we will get another Sicilian. Hopefully we get an accelerated dragon. No. So, of course, as we've established, below 1500 or so, almost nobody plays the Open Sicilian. And at this level, I would say it's about 50-50 between people who play the Open Sicilian, by which we refer to knight f3 and d4. That's the main line. Knight c3 is the entry point. It's the gateway to a bunch of different anti-Sicilians. There is no one name for knight c3. It's just a developing move, but it's the entry point for the Closed Sicilian and the Grand Prix attack, which is f4 in the next move. There is also a very popular line that goes bishop to b5. This is the recommendation in a lot of books that advocate anti-Sicilians. And the caveat that I'll share, not the caveat, the disclaimer that I should share is that me personally, as a Najdorf player in real life, I play the move d6 here. And I've already explained the rationale behind choosing between d6, e6, and knight c6, which are all totally viable continuations. Which of them you choose depends on which Sicilian you play against knight f3 and d4, because white could conceivably play knight f3 on the next move and move order you into a Sicilian that you don't play. That's why we play knight c6, because for the purposes of this speedrun, we're accelerated dragon players. So if white plays knight f3 in this position, we want to be able to play g6 and transpose into the accelerated. Okay, that's a lot of blah, blah, blah. Let's focus on bishop b5. So the move here that is considered very standard is knight c6 to d4. Much like in the Trompowsky, on the other flank, you play knight f6 to e4. But that's not the only move, right? You can still play g6. You can still play e6. And I would like to avoid theory in this game. So we're going to play an alternative that is not very common, which is the immediate g6. We're basically going to play the accelerated dragon structure, the accelerated dragon moves, against the slightly different Closed Sicilian. We're going to go g6. And the reason that this move isn't considered the best is because of bishop takes c6. But if you think about it, right, we've already faced the Rosolimo, which is essentially the Ruy Lopez against the Sicilian. And in the Rosolimo, it's totally standard for us to allow the move bishop takes c6 because, yes, our pawn structure is damaged, but we also get the bishop pair, and we get a lot of good stuff in return for the sort of visual damage. And one of the other good things that we get, if we take with a b pawn, which is what we're going to do, we get early access to the d5 square. We're able to push d5 rather quickly if we want to. So we get the bishop pair, we get the b file, and we get pretty decent control of the center. I think that's a pretty good bargain, even though white is considered to be slightly better according to theory. Like if you turn on the engine, yes, white is better here. But I've always found that this is a very good practical way to dodge a lot of the theory of this variation. Okay, so how should we proceed? White is playing the recommended moves. White is grabbing space on the king side with f4. We basically have an early choice. We can, of course, play d5, or we can play d6, which is a more modest move. And either way, we're going to continue by developing our knight. I'd like to show everybody a really cool setup that I think is very underrated and that I think poses serious problems to white. Actually, let me think about whether we want to do that here or not. So I'm trying to decide actually between d6 and d5 here. And there's a lot of positional considerations that I don't have time to explain right now that I'll sort of tackle in more depth after the game. Okay, let's go d6. Let's play this more in the sort of Sicilian spirit. And you might be wondering, okay, like what is possibly the downside of pushing d5. Isn't that just clearly the better move because it controls more of the center? Not quite. d5 has some serious drawbacks, one of which is that white can push e5 and blunt our bishop, and the c5 pawn could become a serious target as a result. Right now, that pawn is nicely protected by its neighbor on d6. So I think most people's instincts here is, of course, to play knight f6 and to castle. But as I've already talked about in a previous speedrun game, this setup, which is the Grand Prix attack setup, is incredibly dangerous. And one of white's ideas is to push the f-pawn to f5 and later to trade dark squared bishops with bishop h6. I'll remind you of how bad things can go for black if you're not careful in this position. But there is an idea that was taught to me many, many years ago by my coach. And this is not a well-known idea. I'll show you how this is applied in the Closed Sicilian, and I had some games where I applied this idea with a lot of success. And it's the move knight to h6, which already should get your weird senses going. Like, what on earth are we doing on h6? Where are we going? And you might say, oh, I get it, we're going to g4. No, we're not. Because the moment the knight hits g4, it's chased back by the h-pawn. So what on earth is the point of heading to g4? Instead, we're preparing something. And this something is a way to contest the kingside to prevent white from carrying out his main kingside plan, which always involves the move f5. If white doesn't get f5 in, then white's dark squared bishop is left without a clear home. You might also know that after white castles short, this queen from d1 usually migrates over to h4, where it applies serious pressure on black's kingside. So it's very easy to get checkmated in this type of position. What is it that we're preparing? We're preparing the move f5. We're preparing f7, f5, by which we freeze the pawn on f4. We contest some of the center, and we create tension in the center that draws white's attention away from the king side and toward the part of the board where black has a superiority. I think our opponent doesn't really know what we're preparing. h3 is a clear sign that he was expecting us to go to g4. So that's kind of a tempo loss, and we shouldn't dilly-dally. We should play f5 immediately. We don't want to allow white to expand on the king side with g4. Our knight could actually get trapped as a result, so definitely we want to strike with f5 right away. And the other thing that I like about this approach is that we're facing our opponent with a set of challenges that he's likely to be unfamiliar with. And most people, when they study these types of structures from the white side, they kind of take for granted that the knight is developed to f6. So at higher levels, it's actually a great idea to analyze sidelines, not necessarily on the first or second move, but to find sidelines within more popular openings, because your opponent is just less likely to know the theory and also less likely to know the typical ideas. So your opponent is going to be on their own sooner rather than later, which is always a good thing. As my coach would say, make them use their own brain, not Stockfish's brain. Again, no question in my mind that objectively black is worse here. Let me not embellish the situation. I think white has a slight but stable advantage. But in order to assert this advantage and carry it forward, white will have to be very accurate. White will have to successfully solve the problem of the central tension. And in particular, what I mean is that white will have to choose the right time to push the pawn down to e5. Taking on f5 is a terrible idea for white because it relinquishes white's control of the center. It allows the knight from h6 to jump into the action via f5 and later d4. And in general, it just releases the tension to black's favor. We also have the bishop pair, so if the position opens up, then our light squared bishop is going to be really, really happy. But if white plays e5 prematurely, what could happen is that e5 pawn itself becomes a serious weakness. So there's a lot of positional and tactical subtleties that are at play here, and I'm going to try to demonstrate some of them during and after the game. Okay, queen e2. So how should we proceed? Well, there's really no doubt in my mind that we need to safeguard our king, so let's castle kingside. That is a non-committal move, which we know we have to play at some point. So let's play it now. And there is a tactical trick that so many players miss, which is a typical property of this knight h6 f5 line. It starts with e5. We respond by tucking our knight away on f7. And in that position, castling kingside blunders Yeah, it blunders a pawn, and that's a very hard tactic to see if you're not already aware that it exists. So we'll see what our opponent comes up with here. We also could have played, yeah, we could have played e7, e5 and created the pawn box, but with the king still in the center, that's way premature, especially with the queen x-raying the king. We don't want to open up the center just yet. Now, I would seriously consider the move e5 on the next move, although it is very, very risky. Because if you think about it, once the pawns are traded, we are reopening white's dark squared bishop, and we're seriously weakening the doubled pawns on the queen side. So the fact that our opponent is devoting a lot of time is a clear sign that he's sort of on his own. Okay, so again, the position is relatively closed, which means that there are more than one options, more than one decent move in every position, but in every one of these positions on the next few moves. But I'd like to continue in the spirit of this setup. So there is one more improving move that we should always make. We've got a knight on h6. What was the purpose of putting it there? Well, it was to prepare f5. But now that we've played f5, it's time to find the knight a better and more permanent home. While there aren't that many houses for sale, the real estate market is crazy. The only square is f7. Let's bring it back to f7. You might look at this and say, well, I don't get how this move, how the knight on f7 is better than on h6. Well, first of all, knights on the rim are grim. On h6, it was really controlling nothing. At least now it's controlling some squares in the center on the king side. But the main appeal of this move will be revealed if white plays e5. e5 is a tactical blunder here. I'm hoping our opponent plays it so I can demonstrate this idea. But, you know, a 2000 player probably should see this concept and see through it. Now, of course, also on f7, the knight is preparing a potential pawn push e7, e5. Bishop d2. Okay, so moot point, put it aside. Bishop d2 by our opponent. I'm assuming that he's preparing rook a to e1, and then he's going to consider pushing e5. We're still not afraid of e takes f5. We can just recapture with the bishop. That's not a problem. Okay, so let's think about this for a moment. What options are available to us? Well, we could toss in the move rook b8. One thing that we could do, totally risk-free, and it's not going to hurt us, we know that, is just to play the move rook b8. And you want to be comfortable. Oh, actually, I had a good move queen b6 also. I just realized that. Although queen b6 would have run into knight a4. I was thinking about queen b6 and then pushing the c-pawn with a discovered check, right? Because anytime your opponent pushes their f-pawn and castles kingside, you should always be aware of what's happening on this diagonal. So I'm making a mental note to myself to constantly look for bishop d4 check and maybe queen b6 and c4, because that could become important later in the game. In fact, the reason that e5 is a tactical blunder has to do directly with the fact that the a7 g1 diagonal is exposed. So a lot of people are suggesting bishop to a6. Now, bishop a6 was a very reasonable move. What worries me after bishop a6 is actually e takes f5. Because just a couple of moves ago, we had 4 defenders on this pawn, and e takes f5 didn't seem like a problem. It's still not a problem here, but it becomes a problem if you move your bishop away from c8, because I really don't want to take back with the pawn. Taking back with the pawn creates massive strain on our king side. White could start harassing that pawn with knight h4, even queen to e6 could be a possible move if the bishop moves away from c8. So for the time being, let's keep our bishop on c8. I really like moves like rook b8 because there's a low price tag, right? You know that this move is not going to harm your position, but the reward is pretty immense. We've just forced white to spend 2 minutes and make a rather weakening move. Now the knight on c3 is really soft, and that could help us in certain situations if the position opens up. We never know when something like that could come in handy. So I think some of you might be tempted by queen to a5. But if you look at that move carefully, it walks into an x-ray, and white could even play a move like knight a4, attacking the queen, and then the rook could move into e1. And we want our queen participating in the action. I'm anticipating that the center is going to open up at some point, so we want to keep our queen in the vicinity of the center. I actually have to think here for a couple of moments, so I'm going to think in silence. Yeah, and I mean, I'm not BSing. This really is a very complicated position. People watching on YouTube are like, this is lame. He has to think. Okay, I think it's time to play e5. I think this is as good as any of a moment to strike with e5. So again, what is the... This might seem ridiculously complicated to you. In fact, it's not hard to calculate that black doesn't lose any material here because both of our pawns that form the pawn box are extremely well defended, right? If white plays f takes e5, we take back with a knight. Now, from a bird's eye positional standpoint, the reason that we're trying to open up the center is because we have the bishop pair, and it's also because white's king is a little bit weak, right? White's already pushed the f pawn. I guess we've done the same. But when you have a fianchettoed bishop, that lends a lot of support to your king. White doesn't have that equivalent. So if you think about it, let's say white plays fe, which he just did. Of course, we don't want to take back with a pawn here and weaken the doubled pawns and blunt our own bishop. We take back automatically with the knight. Let's say that white plays knight takes e5. We take back with the bishop. Well, hopefully you can notice that the bishop is aiming at the h2 square, and our queen is only 2 steps away from combining with the bishop to form a battery and form unstoppable mate threats. Okay, so broadly speaking, the side of the bishop pair benefits if the position opens up because it makes it easier to exploit uncontested squares that your bishops control. And the second factor actually is this loose knight on c3, which could be targeted in a lot of lines. White's bishop right now is tied down to its protection, which is creating further strain on white's position. Rook a1 is a great move by our opponent, but I think it gives us an opportunity to do something really, really productive. We could continue expanding on the king side and basically set up a potential pawn storm that could be supported by our light squared bishop and our dark squared bishop. Right now, our light squared bishop is kind of butthurt because it's staring at its own pawn. So you might say, well, then let's take on e4. But I don't want to take on e4 because that would allow white's knight to jump into the center. Even though, broadly speaking, we want to open up the center, we don't want to do it at the cost of allowing white's pieces to get really active. And you might, well, what is dangerous about the knight on e4? Well, it's the fact that, first of all, when it's on c3, the knight is vulnerable, as we've already established. If it lands on e4, it's putting a lot of pressure on our weak pawns in the center. And hopefully you can see that that's really not the way to go. Instead of playing f takes e4, I want to play the move f4. And again, it might seem like I'm constantly contradicting myself. I just said we want to open up the center. Now suddenly we're keeping it closed. You know, what are we doing? Well, we're not really keeping the center closed, right? f4 is a move on the king side. The center is still open enough for us to be able to benefit from it. If you look at these squares on e5 and d4, our bishop is already controlling those squares. Our pawn is controlling an important square on d4. So what does f4 accomplish? Well, a couple of things. It's blunting white's dark squared bishop even further. And this pawn is not at any risk of getting captured. Knight e5, bishop e5, and we have enough defenders. And even if we didn't, white could not leave its babysitting of the c3 knight. And worst comes to worst, we could support the pawn with g7, g6, g5. And g5 is a move that we might actually play voluntarily as part of a pawn storm that I just mentioned. Consider what would happen if we played g5, h5, and then g4. That's only 3 moves. And those pawns on f4 and g4 are going to be incredibly menacing. If you're a King's Indian player, you should sort of subconsciously and intuitively appreciate the power of a pawn storm like that. So we're only 3 moves away from carrying that out and putting that into effect. And this pawn produces a cramping effect on white's pieces. All of them are now sort of just, lazily staring at the pawn. White is suffering from a lack of space. I feel like I said that unintentionally with a New York accent. When your opponent takes a prolonged think like this, and already white is down to 6.5 minutes, it's a good idea to generate a list of helpful moves that you could play unless your opponent does something super committal or something that forces you to react. Knight d1 is a great move. I actually was going to point out that this is the best move. What is the idea of knight d1? Well, our opponent moves the knight away from a vulnerable square, and my guess is that he wants to put a bishop on c3 rather than a knight in order to contest the bishop on g7. But what you should notice is that even if our opponent plays bishop c3, that does not create any threats. Yes, then if white takes on e5, we're going to have to recapture with the pawn. And we've already discussed that that comes with a significant price tag. But our main goal now has shifted from the center to the king side, where we're trying to put into effect this pawn storm with g5 and h5 and g4. So it may be worth paying the price of blunting our bishop in order to make that happen. So I don't see any reason that we should not initiate our attack with g5. We could also improve our position with a move like queen to e7, for example, right? Or maybe even bishop to e6. So largely we have a choice between getting down to business and rolling up our sleeves and making a couple more preparatory moves. And I will tell you, I'm not sure that g5 is best. Maybe bishop e6 or just a calm developing move is what the computer would prefer. Like one more of those moves would make the attack stronger. But I would also argue that g5 isn't such a committal move. It's not like we play g5 and then we can't go back and play bishop e6. Yeah, the pawn is a little bit of a weakness, white's pressuring it. But in an emergency, we could even play h6 and build up a pawn chain. So this is, I think, what's important when you're initiating an attack. It's to make the least committal moves first, if possible, of course. And when you make the least committal move first, you maintain the flexibility to change your approach if your opponent does something unexpected or something that you missed, or you realize suddenly, wait a second, the attack is not as strong as I thought it was going to be. You can double back and start making improving moves instead. Knight f2. So clearly our opponent is respecting the threat of g4. The upside for us of this move is that bishop c3 is no longer a possibility, because then we play knight takes f3 check and the bishop has lost its defender. So a great example of over stubbornness would be h5. h5 would be a blunder because after knight e5, white will be able to take that pawn. We also should not play... Actually, queen e8 is interesting, but that blunders the pawn on g5. Also not appetizing. So I actually think that this is a great time for us to make a slower move, for us to make a preparatory move that shores up our pieces and solidifies our position and gives our other pieces more flexibility. I like the move h6 here because I am annoyed that our queen is not able to get to g6. I think if the queen got to g6, that would be a great square for the queen because it would be preparing g4, and it's just a nice, safe square that's out of the way of the other pieces. There is a reason that I don't want to play bishop e6 just yet, and it's a very complicated reason, so I'll save the explanation until after the game, assuming, of course, that our opponent doesn't play the move that I think he might make. But, okay, the TLDR is that in certain situations, if our opponent moves the c-pawn, I wanted to reserve the right to play bishop to a6, which is a completely senseless move otherwise, but if the pawn on d3 has been softened up, bishop a6 should make a lot of sense to you as a way to put pressure on this newly weakened pawn. Knight takes e5. Okay, so now a big decision. From a positional standpoint, there's no question that we should take with the bishop. From a tactical standpoint, taking with the pawn actually makes a lot of sense because what that move does is it solidifies the f4 pawn even further, and it will make it a little bit easier for us to play h5, g4 in the future. So d takes c5, very clear drawback. It weakens the queen side. We might end up losing the c5 pawn, but if we want to checkmate our opponent, then we should take on e5 with the pawn. That's a very King's Indian style move. I'm not sure which move we should play. I'll be honest. I'm really not sure. My intuition says pawn takes e5, but the Capablanca inside of me says bishop takes e5. The moral of the story is don't trust Capablanca. Trust the Mikhail Tal. Trust the Tal voice inside of you. Yeah, Capablanca would be cringing hardcore at this move. And it might be a mistake. We might pay the price and lose. But we'll see. At least I'll die trying. Okay, queen h5. That's a great move, actually. So now our next step is to chase this queen out of h5. There's no doubt that we are not going to be able to play h5 unless what? Unless the queen is chased out of h5. There's only one piece mathematically capable of chasing the queen out of h5, and that would be the bishop. From where can the bishop chase the queen out of h5? Well, f7 or e8. Bishop e6 just seems like a more natural developing move than bishop to d7. Now, don't worry about knight g4 here, which I think our opponent might be banking on, because it's a move with an incredibly dangerous drawback for white, which is that the queen is then trapped. And after knight g4, we shouldn't play bishop to f7 because knight takes h6 check weasels out of the situation, but the pawn has to be first defended with king h7. But after that, we'll be threatening bishop f7, and then the queen will be trapped. White might just have to move the knight back to f2, and it might already be too late. Our attack is certainly not gone. Our attack hasn't even started yet, but once it starts, once the wheels start turning, I can assure you that the attack is going to be ridiculously powerful. This is this ability to understand what's going to happen in the long run. Right now, it seems lame. We haven't played h5 yet. We're not even close to playing h5. Actually, we are very close to playing h5. If we play bishop f7, forcing the queen away, guess what? We play h5, and the moment we get this pawn to g4, I think those pawns are going to tear white apart, and you should kind of understand that intuitively. What I also like about this position is that if you look at these pawns on the queen side, they produce a very disgusting visual effect, but they're hard to attack. This bishop, in order to attack the c5 pawn, needs to make a two-move maneuver. And even if it gets to a3, okay, even if it wins the pawn on c5, is that pawn mission critical to our kingside attack? It absolutely isn't. We could even afford to lose our entire queenside and the attack would carry on. And that's the important thing to understand about openings that involve an attack on the kingside, like the King's Indian. That's the clearest similar opening to the position that we have. You often need to give up an entire flank or a ton of material on that flank because you don't have the time to waste. Yeah, our opponent is really struggling here to find a move. I don't really know what our opponent should do. It's a very difficult position for white. I think our decision to take on e5 with a pawn is a really good one. h4, okay. So now things get very concrete. h4 is an excellent move, by the way. I think this might be the only way for white to stay alive. Wow, I'm impressed with this move. I saw it out of the corner of my eye, but I underestimated it. This is a great move. I don't think it solves white's problems, though, for the record. And I think the way to keep posing problems is extremely counterintuitive. My intuition is suggesting a ridiculously counterintuitive move. What is the intuitive move? Well, I would argue, well, first of all, some of you might be attracted to g4, but after knight takes g4, I don't see a clear way to continue because you have to waste the tempo on king h7. Also, the e5 pawn is hanging there. I don't like it. The counterintuitive move is g takes h4. And in the interest of time, I'm going to play this move and then I'm going to explain it. You might look and say, well, this defeats the whole purpose of our entire attack, which was to play g4. But you have to assess this position on a separately from the previous position. Because yes, we don't have the capacity to play g4, but in return, some doors close, other doors open. Very important to understand that in the context of evaluating ideas. You can't be dogmatic and you can't tell yourself, either I carry out this idea or it's a total failure. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the move queen to g5, which is a huge threat as a result. Why is it a threat? Because if the queens are traded, then everything is set right again, and then we will be able to play g4. And even in the endgame, these pawns are going to massacre white on the king side. Not to mention that we are up a pawn, and that cannot be discounted either. We're up a pawn, right? I just took a free pawn. Also, the g file is opened. And that might be the more obvious factor to you. The g file can be readily exploited. All we need to do is move our king out of the way, and boom, we put a rook on g8. That pawn on g2 is in our crosshairs. So we'd have to bring the king over, move the rook over, and then move the dark squared bishop over. But because the center is close, 3 moves isn't such a long time. But hopefully everybody realizes why queen g5 is such a dangerous threat. If white does not trade queens and moves the queen back to f3, then we're already aiming down the g file. And there we can optimize the process by lifting our rook from f6 to g6 with a huge attack. And of course, this h pawn can be used as a battering ram. We can push it to h3 at some point and shatter white's only remaining king protection. I think g takes h4 is almost a no-brainer at a high level. Almost a no-brainer, which doesn't mean if you don't, understand the rationale behind that move that you should feel bad. But hopefully that explanation made sense. Knight h3 is an excellent move. I have to commend our opponent. He's finding, I think, the only way to stay in the game. Now, we have a lot of tempting moves here. There's bishop to f7. Obviously, the idea of knight h3 is to stop queen g5. We could take on h3 and play queen g5 check and trade queens, but then the position becomes uncomfortably closed, and I think white has excellent drawing chances in the ensuing endgame. Let's see if we can find a more clever way to play. I'm going to think about this in silence for a little while. I have a really interesting idea, but I have to consider it much more carefully. I think there's a couple of tempting candidate moves. I like the look of king h7. I like the look of king h7 and then rook g8 as we discussed. I also really like the look of queen to d7, which is a weird looking move, but could be very, very good because it prepares bishop to g4. I also like bishop to f6, which is maybe the least intuitive move of all of them, but it protects the h4 pawn, and we could actually involve the other rook into the attack via g7. Okay, let me decide. To me, the tiebreaker is to make the most flexible of all the moves, which in my eyes is king to h7, because this doesn't commit us to any particular way of playing. Very important. You might look at this and say, wait a second, we're walking into a pin and white is knight g5 check. No, knight g5 check is not possible, of course. We now need to keep contact with the g5 square as long as we don't protect it with another piece, which is what we're going to do. On the next move, unless white poses a threat, we're going to play bishop to f6. Then our queen is much more free, and we're preparing rook g8. And if both of those moves are made, if we play bishop f6 and then we play rook g8, we will be threatening bishop e6 to g4, which simply traps white's queen. Okay, does that make sense? So bishop f6, rook g8, and bishop g4 are our three next moves, unless white poses us a concrete threat, which he does not. King h1 is not a threat. I don't see any reason for us to refrain from the move bishop f6. Let me think about this. Yes, I think it's a perfect opportunity to play bishop f6. We have to be very, very careful. And hopefully you're able to see what we have to be careful about. I was briefly considering a sacrifice on f4, like knight takes f4, ef, and bishop takes f4 is nothing to sneeze at because it attacks the h6 pawn, but we can simply drop our bishop back to g7. And this is the importance of playing flexibly. You're able to adapt to the new set of circumstances because you haven't committed your pieces to any squares where they can't go back from. Okay, bishop c3. That's another good move, but I think our opponent's defensive strategy is starting to falter. Okay, so what's important here is that we can play rook g8 anyway, or we can, but then white has bishop takes pawn, and if we play bishop g4, white takes the bishop, I'll show this after the game, and hits our queen, and then the white queen gets an escape route via the 5th rank. So can we find another way of preparing bishop g4 that circumvents this problem? Well, yes, there's queen to d7, which I've previously mentioned. Then, if bishop takes e5, we can play bishop g4, and I believe the queen is trapped. I don't think white has any way of escaping that, so let's go queen d7. And again, hopefully that logic made sense. We're threatening bishop g4. And bishop f7 is also a potential possibility in an emergency, because then the f5 square is going to be protected by our queen. I mean, it's a move that you should be... Okay, and our opponent blunders. I mean, there was no defense. The only defense was knight h3 back to f2. But then we would have played rook g8, and that position is completely winning, because we're just massacring him down the g-file. I don't think there's any long-term defense there. But our opponent collapses. It's like the Smyslov approach. We pose 10 threats in a row, and eventually your opponent gets low on time, and they miss one of them. Only 23 moves, which is crazy to me. It's like the game the day before yesterday, which was only like 30 moves or something, but it's felt like so much longer. We spent almost all of our time in the middle game, and there's a lot to unpack here. This was great. All right, GG. Lovely game. There's a couple of critical moments that I want to hit on. After knight c6, okay, first of all, first things first, let me quickly recap why knight c3 is such a tricky move. So let's say that you're an accelerated dragon player, and you learned from a book that the best move is d6. Well, now white can play knight f3. And you've gotten what's called move ordered, using that as a verb. You've gotten move ordered into an Open Sicilian that you don't play. If you're a knight or a player, no problem. You play knight f6, white plays d4, and you play the knight. But if you're an accelerated player, then you have a problem. The only way to avoid d4 is to play the move e5, but it should be self-evident why this move is bad. You're weakening key squares in the center. What's interesting is that there is a legitimate line where you play e5 here, but I really don't recommend it to beginner and intermediate players. This is a legitimate line. You'll find a lot of grandmaster games here, but I think it's very dubious positionally. So again, the move that you play on move 2 depends first and foremost on what you play against knight f3 and d4. Because we're accelerated dragon players, we play knight c6. Knight f3, we respond with g6, and after d4, we're chilling. By the way, if you're a Paulson player, you're a Tamanov player, you want to go e6. This is, I think, a great move against knight c3, but again, you have to be ready to face knight f3. If you're a Tamanov player, no problem. Knight c6, d4, cd, and queen c7. Now, of course, in many cases, your opponent who plays knight c3 is not an Open Sicilian player. So oftentimes you can get away with playing d6 or e6. You're not going to get knight f3 a lot of the time. But I'm trying to make the most objectively, sort of the most objective opening recommendations, and you have to factor in this type of idea. Okay, so we play knight c6, and here white has a crossroads. There are three major moves here. One of them is what our opponent played, bishop to b5. We faced it once before, a game that I think I actually lost. G3 is called the Closed Sicilian. This is an older move that's still very popular. I used to play this with white. And then the third main move is f4, which is the entry point to the Grand Prix attack, which I think we've also faced. What I'm not going to do is look carefully at the Grand Prix attack and the Closed Sicilian, because there's more than enough to look at after bishop b5. Now, I mentioned that knight d4 is the most popular move by far, and I referenced the Trumpowski. The Trumpowski goes d4, knight f6, and now bishop to g5. And you might be aware that the main move here is knight f6 to e4, immediately hitting the bishop. Of course, the knight is later chased away from the center, but the way you can think of it is both sides lose a tempo, and those tempos cancel each other out. White's going to have to move the bishop, and then black will have to move the knight. Super, super complicated opening. Named after Octavio Trumpowski, a Brazilian player. Yes, I know what people are thinking. Okay, so bishop b5, knight d4 is wildly theoretical. This is a super theoretical line. Already at this point, white has a further crossroads. There's the very dangerous move knight f3, which is what we faced previously. And I did some analysis in this position. There's the traditional move, which is bishop c4. Generally, black plays e6, and then white tries to smoke out this knight with the move. The main line here is knight g2, although knight f3 is almost as popular. And I think the move that's all of the rage now is... What is all the rage? I think there's even a move where black goes back to c6. This is super popular now. Going back to c6, and you might say, well, white will play d4 and get an Open Sicilian with an extra tempo. Yeah, but this bishop is really stupid on c4. It's just biting on granite. So I will leave the analysis of this position to you. We might get another game here, and I might play knight d4. The reality is that I'm not too familiar with this line from black's perspective, because again, as a Najdorf player myself, I played d6 here, and bishop b5 check in this position is still a move, but it's really not as dangerous because black can block with bishop d7. Okay, and okay, this is a reasonable line from white's perspective. Its position is equal, but there's nothing to fear here. All right, so let's focus on the move that we played in the game, which is of course g6. So white correctly plays bishop takes c6, and we decided in this game to take back with the b pawn. Our opponent's next move is totally sensible, d3. We fianchetto our bishop. White plays f4. This is the recommended way of approaching this position, and we responded with d6. So again, why didn't I play instead the move d5? Which actually the engine does prefer d5 to d6. But what worried me about this move, let's say white plays knight f3. Okay, here I actually missed a a pretty cool idea that transitions into an endgame. Who can tell me how black can force the queens off the board and reach an opposite colored bishop endgame? Who sees this hidden idea? And this will lead me to a detour that hopefully will enable me to make an instructive point. Yeah, bishop takes c3 check. And it's always hard to convince yourself to give up your fianchettoed bishop, and for good reason, right? Normally, you don't want to give up your fianchettoed bishop for anything because it leaves your kingside permanently weak. But there are exceptions, and those exceptions are if there's a tactic that allows you to win material, and or if there's some way, let's say, to get into an endgame, because in an endgame, the role of weak squares and weaknesses in general is greatly diminished. This position strikes me as about equal. Both sides have very weak and symmetrical queen sides. I think this is dead equal. So in terms of equalizing, I think d5 might be the better move. I will confess that I missed bishop c3, but white can also play e5 immediately. But the thing that happens after white plays e5, much like in an opening like the Caro-Kann, you can draw a parallel between this type of structure and a lot of situations that you get in the French defense or in the Gurgenidze opening, which goes e4, g6. This is the modern. The Gurgenidze, who can tell me? Let's see who knows. What is the Gurgenidze? Which move in this position? Hikaru plays this very often, represents the Gurgenidze system, named after a Georgian grandmaster. It's c6, sort of a cross between the Caro-Kann and the modern. Very good, Harry. And if white plays f4, which is the main line, you get virtually an identical situation on the king side. And black's main idea in the Gurgenidze is actually to establish full control of the light squares on the king side. That's why you often see black playing h5. This prevents g4, and the move g4 controls this very important f5 square. So black then often follows up with knight h6 and knight to f5. In the Caro-Kann itself, in a lot of lines in the advanced Caro, you get something very similar. Again, you have this f5 square. And in many situations, such as in the short variation, which is considered by now the main line, black often plays knight d7 and then knight e7, and the bishop often drops back, and the knight occupies its place on f5. So basically, black is playing on the light squares. Black is trying to carve out for himself a little kingdom on the king side using those light squares. So you can see something similar in the event that white plays e5 here. Who can tell me which move is really consistent with what I just talked about? One of them is h5, but you don't even need to play h5. You can directly develop the knight to h6. And you might say, well, but white's pawn chain is really annoying. That's true, but in a situation like this, I really like the move f6, chipping away at white's pawn chain. But ultimately, what worried me about a position like this is the fact that these pawns can be very easily targeted. White has this super annoying move, knight a4. Super annoying move, knight a4. And it's actually hard to defend the pawn on c5. Whereas pushing c4, well, then white can play d4 and build up an even more menacing pawn chain. And also white has the c5 square as an outpost. According to the engine, in this exact position, black is fine, because fe, fe, and knight f7 hits the pawn, or actually, no, the computer move here is, knight g4. Go the other way, so attack the e5 pawn. If white defends it, then you keep attacking it with queen c7. And if white defends it again, then you keep attacking it again with rook f5. That's why you play knight g4 rather than knight f7, so that you have this additional move, rook f5. And if white finally takes on c5, black takes this very important pawn on e5, and our pieces start to breathe. In fact, black is already winning here. So it's interesting that black's play on the king side and in the center really counterbalances the weakness of these pawns. But I remember a game that I played years ago, and this influenced my perception, where I got completely outplayed in exactly this kind of structure. I later won that game with a nice combination, but the memory of this game stuck in my mind as I was deciding between d5 and d6. Here's how that game went. And hopefully this detour isn't too extensive. I'm just trying to give you background on, this option and the structures that arise as a result. Here is that game. So it was a very similar opening, actually. Very similar. It was a Grand Prix attack, technically, but it was virtually the same thing. Here you can see that structure. And what ended up happening is I did play the move d5. My opponent played e5. And this position is horrible for black because white's queen is already on h4. And if white has a single more move, he's going to play knight a4 and bishop e3. And this pawn on c5 is going to get under fire. So I kind of desperately played c4, but that didn't really help. White plays dc. And here my opponent did something really stupid. He gave up an exchange with c takes d5 and then d6. This led to a completely wild position. Instead, all white had to do for a huge advantage was play the move b3. This forces black to play dc, and now white could bring the rook to d1, white could bring the bishop to a3, and hopefully you can see how bad the black structure is. And the bishop on g7, of course, is out of commission as well. So anyways, I was influenced by this particular game. While we're on this topic, there was one further detour that I wanted to make, which is to really emphasize the importance of not forgetting that giving up your fianchettoed bishop is a legitimate device in some positions, and it's one of the easiest moves to miss. My coach did an entire lesson on examples where one side gives up their fianchettoed bishop in order to achieve something. There was a famous game, Wojciech against Caruana, where Fabi gives up his King's Indian bishop for positional reasons. But here's a very famous game where black gives up, well, I won't tell you exactly what happens, because I have already given it away. But take a look at this position in a game between the young Gata Kamsky and GM Sergei Tvyakov. Here in this position, Gata plays the pretty reasonable-looking move, knight to d4. Who can spot the blunder in white's last move? The hidden blunder, I should say. Bishop takes d4. Okay, but what's the follow-up, folks? Come on. Yeah, bishop d4. Bishop takes d4. And now the hidden trick. Yeah, you play e6 and you chase the knight away. Big deal. Knight has to go back to e3. Knight f4, e5 is a fork. But now, after knight e3, black goes e5, and the bishop is trapped. Bishop has only one square, and after rook b7, the bishop is lost. And Kamsky was forced to give that bishop up, and he ended up losing the game, as you can see. So anyways, just file that away in your sort of mental directory of ideas. And so I can see that it turns out d5 might be a superior move, despite the drawbacks associated and the dangers associated with this particular pawn structure. Okay, so we decided to play d6. After knight f3, I really like this idea of playing knight h6. One further detour. I will prove to you that I have known this idea for a long time, and the first time that I tried it was against none other than Robert Hess in a game where I had a lot of success with this setup. Here is the game against Hess where I first trotted out this this crazy-looking idea. I won't show you the whole game. This is a super complicated game. 2008, the first time Hess and I faced each other. Not the last. Not the last. So it was a closed Sicilian, and my coach had taught me this line, and I figured, to hell with it. I'm just going to go knight h6. And it's the same exact idea. You're preparing the move f5, then the knight drops back to f7, so you can see the same ingredients, the same types of moves. Okay, here we trade knights, but later in the game, I played the move e5, again creating the same pawn box. I got a great position, and the game ended in a draw. So exactly the same ideas here with the move knight h6. The reason I don't like knight f6 is because black could get checkmated so quickly, and I've already shown examples of this in a previous speedrun video, but just to sort of reiterate, let's say black, just kind of dilly-dallies, white gets the queen takes. No big deal. Let's grab some space. Well, after f5, already black is on the cusp of getting checkmated because white gets the bishop to h6, the knight jumps into g5, and all that stands between black and checkmate is this measly knight on f6. And there's so many cool tactics that are associated with getting this knight out of the picture. For example, if you consider a position like this, whatever, let's make a random move for black. White has a beautiful tactical idea that's actually very typical in Grand Prix attack structures. I'll let you guys try to find it. White to play, and it's forced checkmate. You know what the goal is. The goal is to deflect the knight on f6, but it's easier said than done because the d5 square is controlled. You play the move e5. Black takes, and you vacate the e4 square for the knight. Black has to take with a pawn, and now the rook opens up, and rook takes f6 leads to checkmate, because now h7 cannot be protected. So something to remember, ways to deflect the f6 knight. This is classic across many openings. So in a nutshell, this is why I wanted to play knight h6 and f5, to prevent white from himself playing the move f5 before it's too late. Okay, so queen e2, we'll skip over castles. And I already think that after knight f7, black's position is very decent. Looking at the engine, it does give equality here, so it's not like white is objectively all that much better. Maybe a tiny edge. What I kept dancing around during the game was the reason why e5 is bad. Now that the game is over, who can tell me why e5 is a mistake? And it's not as hard as I made it out to be, but it's just unexpected. Black to play and win a pawn. It's not rook e8. Rook e8 doesn't really do anything because it puts the rook on a closed file. Yeah, so it's d takes e5, f takes e5, knight takes e5, and then queen d4 check picks up the knight and results in an extra pawn. Bishop e3, queen e5, and that's it. Black is up a pawn. How do you find something like this? Well, it has to do with the fact that white has played f4, so this diagonal is weakened. So you're always looking for ways to exploit that diagonal to your advantage. Okay. So our opponent withstood the temptation and played bishop d8. We throw in the move rook b8. b3 is fine, and we create the pawn box with the move e5. And hopefully the rationale behind this move now makes a certain degree of sense. F takes e5. We take back with a knight. And I think rook a e1 was actually a very serious mistake. I think allowing the move f4 is the beginning of the end for white, because now white is devoid of any active counterplay, whereas we have a very clear plan of attacking on the king side. As counterintuitive as it may appear, I think white should have kept the center open with e takes f5. We would have recaptured with the bishop, and according to the engine, white just collects his pieces in the center with rook a to e1. Black plays a move such as queen d7, to connect the rooks and prepare rook e8. White plays knight takes knight, bishop takes knight, and a move like knight to e4, centralizing the knight. And the position is super complicated. I would take black, but it is equal according to the engine, which gives bishop h6. Now it gives bishop d4 check, king h2. And there's a lot of repetitions here, like bishop e5, king g1 is a draw. Of course, we can play rook f7. But now white plays a nonchalant move like king h1, and the game continues. It's complicated. The problem that black faces in a position like this is that the knight on e4 is very difficult to chase away, because d5 always runs into knight takes c5. So as impressive as black's bishops look, it's hard to actually make progress. And this move is very tempting, but it loses because after rook takes f7, you have to take back with the king, and that walks into knight g5 check, picking up the bishop. So I really think that our opponent's biggest chance to keep the position balanced would have been to not allow us to push the pawn down to f4. And hopefully everybody now understands why f4 is so strong. So f4, and I already think that white is like borderline lost from a practical standpoint. Our opponent drops the knight back. We start assembling our attacking forces, g5. And really the most interesting moment occurred, I think, after h6, knight takes e5. Checking the engine, as I hinted at, bishop takes e5 is preferred by the computer. And the computer almost always weighs the positional considerations highly, piece placement and square control. The new Stockfish really appreciates the value of those things, which is what makes chess computers now so much stronger than they used to be, right? They used to greatly underestimate the value of certain positional considerations. The reason I didn't take with the bishop again is because I felt like closing down the center helps us focus our attention more directly on playing h5 and g4. I also was a little bit annoyed by the prospect of knight g4, but now that I look at it, we can just drop our bishop back. I was worried about the move e5. I was worried that white would open up the center and create problems, but again, here we just have bishop takes knight, which for some reason I missed. Queen takes bishop, and we can just grab the free pawn with bishop takes e5. There's one innocuous check, and we just lift our king up to h7. The bishop is a hero. And notice how the pawn on c5 is protecting against the possibility of d4. White has some exchange sack, but it doesn't do anything. We just take back. And here we can just trade queens with queen d4 check. So definitely the best move objectively was bishop e5. We played DE. So according to the engine, and this is so interesting because our opponent, he initiated a campaign of trying to prevent our kingside pawn storm. As you could see, it was a losing battle. And it was a losing battle because white has no light squares, right? Yeah, white can use the queen as a stopgap, but we're going to chase the queen out eventually. White can't do anything about that. Instead, the only way I think for white to muddy the waters would have been to go directly for black's only Achilles heel, which are the queenside pawns. Who can tell me a way that white can attack the c5 pawn as efficiently as possible? What's the fastest way, the fastest maneuver in terms of attacking c5? Well, it's not c3. That doesn't do anything. It's not a4. That doesn't do anything. It's bishop to c1. This is the computer mode, the top computer mode. And I still think the engine is underestimating black's play at a lower depth. I think black is much better here. And if queen e8, white immediately sends the bishop to a3. And you might say, well, I remember I was talking about this during the game. What happens if black just ignores everything that white is doing? Well, it's good in principle. The problem is you start losing a ton of crap. You lose the pawn on c5. You don't want to give away this rook. You have to move it. I like to move. And the problem isn't that black loses material. It's what that c5 pawn was doing. What was it doing? Well, it was controlling, along with the e5 pawn, the d4 square. You know that the best way to deflect your opponent's attention from an attack on the side of the board is to strike in the center. When the center opens, the situation destabilizes. When it destabilizes, it's harder to focus in a single-minded fashion on an attack. So white plays the move d4. Yes. And if black just stubbornly continues with queen g6, we're going to run out of pieces pretty soon. So for example, consider this position. Already, you can't play g4 because you drop another pawn. So by opening the center, white is able to take black's attention away. And you might say, well, no problem. Let's just defend the pawn with queen e7. And maybe this is what black should do, but now it's harder to play h5. So according to the engine, in this position, black keeps a big advantage by playing very calmly. Bishop e6, bishop a3, and indeed the move queen e7. The problem is that white has no way to accentuate the attack on the c5 pawn. Perhaps white can move the knight away and try to put a queen on f2, but already here there's the move g4, even without h5. And after h takes g4, queen h4, black develops a furious attack because bishop takes g4 is next. Bishop takes c5, just rook f7, and it's like -2. If white plays back to f2, you can play f3, or you can play h5, sacking another pawn, and just bishop f8. This is a cool line. Black just brings all of the pieces to the king side. f3 is unstoppable, and white's king is going to get massacred. Also, rook h7 takes h5 is very strong. But still, I think it's clear that this was white's only chance to go after the c5 pawn. And in return, notice the two ways of playing. Yes, you can close your eyes and attack, but don't hesitate to make these patient moves in order to eliminate your opponent's counterplay. This is what queen e7 does. By the way, c3 doesn't actually threaten anything. And black could even prepare h5 with king h7, king g6. The engine suggests a5, preventing b4. d4 is not possible because black can take with the bishop at the end. So, anyways, I don't want to beat a dead horse. Queen h5 by our opponent is really the continuation of the end. And again, important not to fear ghosts. Knight g4, don't go bishop f7 because if knight takes h6, you got to calculate, you go king h7. And then bishop f7 traps the queen, much like we did in the game. So h4, we play simply g takes h4. Flexibility, that is the name of the game. In this game, opening up the g5 square for black's queen. This type of position is completely lost for white because g4 is unstoppable. And what I want you to understand is that even in the endgame, these pawn storms are wildly dangerous, let alone the fact that black is up a pawn and everything is unassailable. Like, white just can't stop this from happening. And once f3 happens, I mean, it's very obvious why black is winning here. You just have connected passers. Yeah, g3 also is completely winning. So anyways, that is the key observation. G takes h4. It snags an extra pawn, yes, but it opens up the g5 square for the queen. And as I mentioned during the game, if white tries to keep the queens on the board, then we attack by grabbing the g file with our rook, king h7, rook g8. And if white tries to do the same, well, we move the bishop out of the way. White is out of moves. And we can just triple on the G file. You can improve your position and improve your position. And eventually something is going to give. Something's going to give. Here the engine suggests a very interesting idea. It suggests the idea of moving the queen away from the G file so that the rook could take its place. That's why leading with the queen is often a bad idea. We bring our queen back to f7, and white is not simply cannot stop rook g3, which chases the queen away. Now the queen comes back in, and g2 is hanging. Notice the difference, right? Here the rook is leading, so rook takes g2 as a threat. Here the queen is leading, so this is not possible because at the end of the day, white's going to give his queen up and emerge up a rook. Now, how do I know that I have enough time for all of this? Well, white is out of counterplay. White has no ideas. And okay, if white tries to go after the c5 pawn here, that's like pinching a dinosaur. That does not matter at all. It doesn't matter anymore because black has assembled all of his pieces on the king side. Here, bishop e7 is very strong. Moving the queen away, congrats, you played d4. It doesn't help anymore because rook g3 is still decisive. And it's still the same drill. Okay, so queen is the supporting actress, as Yasser likes to say. In any case, our opponent played knight h3. We played king h7, just the general improving move, king h1, bishop f6. Our strategy is to play rook g8 and bishop g4. The last chance for white, I think, was in fact to sacrifice a piece. And I will admit to one embarrassing oversight. I forgot that after bishop takes f4, the rook in the corner is hanging on b8. That would have changed my strategy. I think king h7 is an inaccuracy, not a mistake. It would have been better to make a move like queen e7. What I forgot about is that the rook is hanging. Now, black is still much better after bishop g5 because you have two pieces for a rook, and not just any two pieces, two very powerful bishops. So it's minus 1.5 here, but according to the engine, black could have kept a much bigger advantage with the move queen to e7. And okay, now knight takes f4 is not dangerous because h6 is not hanging in the end. And if white plays bishop c3, now you can play a move like bishop to d7 to defend the e5 pawn. White is out of ideas, and now you can continue assembling the pieces like we did in the game with bishop f6 and rook g8. So a little bit more prophylaxis would have gone a really long way toward preventing all of white's ideas. Another theme of this game, which is that when you're not in a hurry, it's such a good idea to remove all of your opponent's ideas, because then it'll be so easy for you to attack, because your opponent basically just has to sit around and wait, which is what happened in this game. So I got a little bit lucky that our opponent didn't spot knight takes f4, and after queen d7, the game is over. Technically, queen f3 or knight f2 would have staved off defeat, but after rook g8, hopefully you can already see how decisive the attack down the g-file is. If white plays bishop takes e5, we have a lot of winning moves, but queen to g7 is a really elegant move because it hits g2 with mate, and it hits the bishop. We just win the bishop, we win the game. Probably white has to move the queen away, and now I think the game just ends after rook g3 and rook g8, and h3 is going to tear white apart. Or queen g7, much like we discussed in the game. So the critical moment in this entire game, and our opponent, of course, blunders the queen. Here, there's nothing to talk about. Was, I think, g takes h4. Because I think a lot of people here would be inclined to keep the pawn on g5, and that could have seriously damaged our attacking chances. So if we played a move like queen e7, the eval bar actually goes way up because white establishes a blockade on the light squares, and it's not easy all of a sudden to deal with white's pieces, right? If we go queen d7, there's a nasty little check on h6. Suddenly, black's pawns, which aren't dark squares and are attackable by the bishop, become very weak. So this ability to change your paradigm of attack from one idea to another is really important at higher levels. We started by intending to play h5 and g4. But once white made an unusual move, we adapted to the circumstances. We took the pawn, not trying to make too big of a deal of this move. Perhaps it's obvious to you, but nonetheless, I think it's an important skill that is behind a lot of successful attacks, being able to adapt given what your opponent, the defensive strategy that your opponent is adopting. And of course, the elimination of counterplay and not overestimating pawn structure. Another hidden theme of this game. Our pawn structure was terrible the entire game. Could not possibly care less about the queen side because the pawns were doing their job. These two pawns had one job. It was to prevent white from opening the center, and they did that job amazingly. And that is why white's only chance would have been to attack the only weakness in black's position, the c5 pawn. So I could talk about this game for like an hour. There's a lot more to discuss, but I think this is a good time for us to pause. I don't want to overdo it. I don't want to overload each analysis with too many themes. I think this is enough. And remember that you can always analyze the game on your own. You can always dig deep into the opening if that's what you want to do, or if you have questions that were unanswered, you can analyze with the engine, and that is how you learn. And on that note, guys, I will end. Bortnik is waiting for me, actually, to do the course. So that's what I'm going to be doing. And that means it's time for me to call it a day. Yeah, cool. 3.5 hours. I think that's enough for today. So happy Friday, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the game. This will be up on YouTube as usual. And I will definitely stream tomorrow. Probably first half of the day, actually, because I'm busy in the evening. But I hope you enjoyed the blitz and the vibes and the game. One more time, of course, I have a YouTube channel. Every sub counts. So thanks to everybody who supports. And have a great rest of your Friday, everybody. Thanks for hanging out. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.